mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Everybody, welcome back. We have a great show for you today. I'm your host, Mike Brasher. Joining me in studio is Chris Jennings. It's been a while, man.
Jeez, you forgot my name?
I did not forget your name. That was just all a play. So, Chris Jennings, good to have you here, man.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here.
And we're going to be having a little discussion here, revisiting the breeding population survey results from, I guess, about a week and a half ago now. Joining us for that discussion is our great friend from up in Canada. The one and only Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited Canada. We're excited to have him join us. And I guess this will be the first time that we really had an opportunity to dig in on this report and its data with you. Scott, you're always a great source of information leading up to this report. And we're going to actually have you help us decipher it now. Welcome.
Yeah, good to be here. I thought I was mostly a source of entertainment, though, not information.
Information on this one.
Okay.
And entertainment. You can do both.
All right, I'll try. I'll do my best.
So we are about, a week and a half out, from that survey when it was released by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And again, want to clarify, this is not a Ducks Unlimited survey. It is not a Ducks Unlimited report. We do obviously summarize some of the information and put it out there and help advertise for the Fish and Wildlife Service and all the other folks that contribute to that. But we're going to pick up this discussion. And I guess before we do any sort of in-depth talk and get Scott's perspective, was he surprised? What did he think when he saw the numbers? We have a piece of information we're going to revisit from an episode that, and Scott hasn't heard this yet. I've heard it. Chris has heard part of it. That as a discussion that we had back in February, in an episode that I think aired February 17th, where we were talking with Scott and we were trying to handicap at that time what we thought the total duck population for the traditional survey area was going to be this year. Chris, do we have that ready? Okay, here we go. Let's listen. I'm going to see how you handle this.
Okay.
All right, so last year, the breeding population estimate for the traditional survey area, total ducks, was 34.2 million, right?
Yeah.
What is Dr. Scott Stevens going to put the over-under at for this year?
Well, it's definitely going to be above that, right? Because we had improved production compared to where we were the year before. Good question. I'll say...
That's why I asked it. I'm known for good questions once a week.
Yeah, once a week. I'll say 38 million, given the conditions I'm looking at now.
All right.
If that's where we'll go. 38.
You heard it here first. The over-under from Dr. Scott Stevens is 38.
Lock it in.
I'm going to be a little pessimistic. I'm going to say 36.5. It is above the 34.2. Mathematicians out there can corroborate that. But, I'm going to go 36.5.
36.5.
Perfect.
That was
lock
closer.
those in.
Jennings, do you want to get on the record?
Not yet. I'm going to wait to see the weather.
Okay.
That's a smarter move, Chris. That's smarter.
So you can't put me on the spot. You guys are the experts.
And you never did follow up, even after you saw the weather, Chris. You never gave us an estimate. We never really had an opportunity.
Yeah, we never really had an opportunity to do that, but I'm really glad that I did not pick a number.
He would have gone with 32.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have.
I probably would have gone with 32.4, probably
Chris,
right around there.
Yeah, Chris is often the more pessimistic between the two of us.
Yeah, probably.
Right? So you would have been probably would have been.
I probably would have been a little lower. Yeah,
we would have all probably gone over though.
Yeah, I would have definitely gone over.
Pay homage to the late Bob Barker, who passed away just a few days ago. We would have all gone over. None of us would have won the prize.
None of us would have been in the showcase showdown.
Showcase showdown. Nope.
None of us would have done that. So
that 38, that's a big number, Scott. That was super optimistic. That's like real diehard duck hunter optimism.
Makes me wonder why we even have him on here today.
Exactly. Yeah, that's out to lunch, as it turns out. That's the reason we use data, is because our guesses aren't always that good.
That's right. What's your initial reaction there, Scott?
I was definitely surprised it was down for sure, but quickly once I saw the data, it's like, well, okay, if it was down, my post hoc explanation in front of the data would be, well, last spring, I know at least in this part of the world, was a little late and a little cool and a little weird, and it's like, okay, maybe that impacted production more than we anticipated.
So, Scott, before we get into that a little bit more, I want to just remind folks, the number we're talking about right now from this breeding population, it's called the Waterfowl Status Report. That's what it comes out in. But it's their estimates obtained from the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey. They're conducted May, early June of every year. It is measuring the number of ducks that settle in those breeding landscapes. It's before any production occurs. They are estimates that are extrapolated across that entire survey area. They fly transects. We've kind of covered the methodology on past episodes, but they extrapolate out to these large survey areas, and it is an estimate of the waterfowl population size at the time of that breeding season. That is kind of important to keep in mind, because that's not the number that necessarily waterfowl hunters are going to be so concerned about later in the year. That number later in the year is a function of that breeding population size and the productivity that occurs during the summer, during that spring and summer period, which itself is a function of habitat conditions. Anything to add to that, Scott, to kind of frame that up?
No, that's right. I mean, we think about the BPOP number, which is what we get out of that survey, is the breeding population. So that's what we start with. And that, by the way, is kind of smallest number of birds that we start with for the year, right? And then we're subtracting some throughout the breeding season from that, and then adding production. And then that's what gives us the number of birds that wing their way southward and people see over their decoys.
So the traditional survey area, I think I might have said this already, but the number we had was 32.3 million total ducks in the traditional survey area. That's the largest portion of it. That's that mid-continent, sort of Central Flyway, Mississippi Flyway, Pacific Flyway area. And then you have the Eastern survey area. The number of ducks that are counted or estimated there is typically much smaller. I think this year is 4 or 5 million. I don't have that total number summed here in front of me. But it was that total duck number in the traditional survey area, which was down, and it was down 7% from last year. That number is 9% below the long-term average. Scott, I remember whenever I first saw that report, I was surprised, because I remembered a lot of the conversations we had last year, and I guess that's the other piece of this, is that the breeding population size that we anticipated during our conversation, earlier in the year, would have been a function of last year's breeding population size, the production that occurred last summer,
right,
and then the number of birds that kind of survived and made it back up there this spring. And as you heard, we were all expecting a little bit higher number, because we had talked about the productivity and the end of the drought across a good chunk of that prairie landscape, not all of it, and we were anticipating more production. Now, Scott, I can tell you, I don't know if you looked at this report, but the Fish and Wildlife Service also puts out a report summarizing harvest data from last year. One of the pieces of information in that report is what's called the age ratio, the number of juvenile birds relative to adult birds in the harvest. That data comes from the wing bee surveys, the wings that hunters provide whenever they're asked to participate in that parts collection survey. Those age ratio data were all up last year. You go back and look at the 21 data, which would have been a reflection of the extreme drought of 2021. Those numbers were low. There was very little production. And the data, everybody that hunted that year, 21, 22, would tell you, a lot of old birds in that fall flight. The data bore it out. last year, I think most hunters would also say, yeah, there were more young birds in the flocks in our bag. The age ratio data from harvest also bore that out. So there was production last year. There's going to be production every year, but there was a pretty sizable uptick in production last year over 21. And so that kind of adds to the head scratching of like, well, what's up with these numbers? And like I've said on some of the other things that we've done, we're not going to try to explain every up or down move in these numbers. We just can't, right? Scott, do you feel like you should be able to do that? You know, you're a scientist, right? And so you're supposed to be able to explain why this went up and this went down. And what do you?
I don't feel like I need to. Yeah, there's some of that. I mean, I would say, Mike, I think you talked about this in the webinar session too. It's like if it's plus or minus 5, I sort of go, that's pretty similar. Like, and I wouldn't spend a lot of time explaining plus or minus 5. So remember, we're minus 7 from last year. It's like, okay, so we're probably down, but not a substantial amount. So, you know, we could spin stories all day, but it just means the numbers aren't that different.
I think what Mike's trying to do is just justify why he was wrong, because he does not want to be wrong.
I'm okay being wrong.
No, I'm just kidding.
Wrong all the time.
I would say the one observation that I had, you know, like thinking back, we talked in February. I know the snow melted and we had reports, and then I actually got to see some conditions in early June. I was out east of Saskatoon. We had prairie experience up there. And I know when I got out on the landscape, I was like, oh, it's still pretty darn dry. Like there was water, but there was no shallow water. Like there was no water in seasonal and ephemeral ponds. And I went, okay, so there would be pairs here, but you know, it's really that shallower water that really drives settling of dabbling ducks for sure. And I was surprised how dry it was out in that country. It's like, oh, it was drier than I expected.
Was that this year?
That was this year.
Yeah, I remember Dr. Tom Mormon. I think he was up there for maybe Ducks University. He went up there for something, and I may be confusing the years, but I want to say it was him. It was Tom that said he drove through that area, and there were a larger than expected number of unoccupied ponds. It kind of sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, that would have been last year because Ducks Prairie Experience alternates within. So Ducks University was in Bismarck this year, so it would have been last year that Tom probably would have been up. So yeah, when I was out, it's like, okay, yeah. You know, we had some recovery from drought, but we had no shallow water on that landscape, at least east of Saskatoon, which is Allendana Hills. It's a big target landscape that we invest a bunch of program dollars in, and it was just pretty dry. Not like no water, but it was pretty dry from a settling standpoint, I would say.
Scott, just for, you know, some of our listeners who probably may not be as visually understanding of what the prairie landscape looks like and how it shapes up, kind of describe that the larger wetlands compared to the smaller wetlands, and then also the transition throughout spring and summer. I mean, things can change up there pretty drastically, and that area doesn't really get a ton of rain anyway, or it's not supposed to.
That's right.
But just kind of describe that a little bit, how that, and what do the ducks do when it is dry? Are they all going onto these larger wetlands, or some of them just flying over?
So across these landscapes in the prairies that we're talking about, there would be sort of a full complement of wetlands ranging from ones that are a few inches deep and, you know, may hold water for a few weeks in the spring to, you know, bigger lakes that are, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 feet deep and hold water in all but, you know, the most severe drought. And kind of everything in between. And typically when we think about, okay, what are the conditions when, especially dabbling ducks that feed in those shallow areas, what are the best conditions for them? That would be, we have all kinds of those shallow wetlands are full and brimming with water, you know, after that runoff. And, you know, when I was there in June, it's like, we clearly did not have that this year in that area. So, you know, what do the birds do? You know, I suspect that we've talked about territoriality and those kind of things before on this podcast too. So birds are territorial. Some of those smaller wetlands are dry. They're not setting up on those. Then, the only thing that's left is deeper wetlands, and there's just not as much pair habitat. So, the pair numbers with those conditions, we would expect to be down in some of those areas. What do the extra birds do? They probably push north and into the boreal forest, where we think they find places to breed, but they're probably less productive. So,
Scott, the pond number that which is an index of habitat conditions, breeding habitat conditions in that super important prairie pothole region, it was down 10% from last year. Now 5% below the long-term average. Previous year it was 5.5. This year it was 4.9, basically 5 million. Did that surprise you that it was down?
Yeah, I would say it did because, as I was looking at reports, Mike, like you, I was thinking, we've improved some. It's not as dry as it was the previous year, but, the pond count, so it sort of bears out what I described was my experience on the ground. I got out there and it's like, yeah, there's water. It's not totally dry, but there was not nearly as much water as I was expecting based on the reports that I was reading and paying attention to.
I do want to ask you about a couple of species. Mallard at the top of that. That one is down 18% from last year, now down 23% from the long-term average. And I was talking to Dr. Steve Adair about some of this, and he said, most people would probably look at that and say, I'm a bit surprised because we know we had some production last year. Yeah, and again, recognizing that there is a range around that 18%, right?
Yeah.
He also discussed this idea that it sometimes takes a couple of years before those wetlands that have been dry and oftentimes been farmed if they've been dry. Oftentimes it takes a couple of years for those things to recharge to full productivity. Is there potential for some of what we're seeing here to be like a lag effect of just needing a couple of years of good habitat conditions before we really get to that super production that we know can happen?
That could be part of it. But I guess my counter would be we have a bunch of those shallow ponds that are not in cropland too, right? That don't take a couple years to sort of recover and grow vegetation and be ready to go. And even the ones in cropland, bloom pretty quickly with the aquatic insects. I'm thinking things like fairy shrimp that pintails go crazy over. Like those should have been there if we had water, but clearly we had less water than we did the year before. So that's driving some of it. We know that mallards are a species that will overfly and go into the boreal forest, and just given the density of transects there, we count them. We count them less well when they move further north. We know that's the case with pintails too. There's a correction in the AHM for latitude of centroid of the latitude that they account for those kind of things. It's the same kind of thing happens with mallards. So, am I surprised? Yeah, I was a little bit surprised. Am I worried about mallards? I'm not. Like, they're the most resilient species we have, and I'm still in the boat of I'm confident that if we get the right conditions and the prairies at a widespread scale are sopping wet, like I think we'll see duck production increase. We'll see populations recover. I'm not in the camp of, oh my gosh, this is the end or mallard's going to become extinct. The answer to that is no. I'm pretty confident in that.
Scott, I want to go back to one thing that you mentioned, because I get a lot of people that they kind of wonder about this. When we say that we don't count birds in the boreal forest as well as we do in the prairies, part of that, as you said, is due to the lower density, perhaps more uniform density. We start to get into some sort of statistical design theory here, right? There are a lot of those boreal strata where there are fewer transects. Now, statistical theory would say you're still going to get an accurate estimate from that process, but there's going to be less precision around it. If it's a year where you've got a larger population size there, maybe they're not as distributed as uniformly, then in that situation, you could end up with a little more noise around that estimate, right?
Yeah, the other statistical thing that we need to talk about is detection probability, right?
Yeah.
Like we do an air ground correction for that every year in the prairies, and in the boreal, I think it's a constant factor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been done, it's been corrected, but it's not adjusted on an annual basis. So there are a few of those things that just make it more challenging, as you said, to get precise estimates when birds are further north.
And again, to your point, that is why we don't make conservation decisions, investment decisions on a one-year type of basis. We look at the long term, both in terms of population trajectory as well as sort of habitat trajectory and what those risks and threats are. And so, yes, they do inform harvest regulations on an annual basis, at least here in the States, but that's kind of a separate conversation. Those decisions take into account uncertainty and modeling aspects as well.
Scott, I've got one question for you, and Mike and I have we touched on this, I think last week on the podcast, but the reality is we didn't have the survey for 2 years. So we were kind of, we're assuming, it's, numbers are up. Well, we didn't really know. They could have been really down. This could be way up compared to what. But the reason why I'm asking you that is because did you see that stark contrast, or has it been pretty stable as far as what you've just you mentioned you laid eyes on, wetlands in June, and we're able to, you're kind of surprised that it was so dry. But when you've done that the last few years, has it been pretty consistent, or did you notice, oh man, it's really, when we knew it was pretty dry, but we just don't have the data to back it up?
Yeah, well, the second year that we missed with the survey was real dry. Okay. So I think my prediction, which we've already demonstrated is not very good, but my prediction for that year would have been, the BPOP number was probably lower than we saw this year. Back, what would that be now?
21,
yeah.
Yeah, that would be my guess. It was dry.
Yeah.
And things improved a bit, last year, and we thought, we thought maybe things that had improved a little bit more this year, but it wasn't the case. It was back pretty darn dry again, and as I know we're just getting ready for this season, but as we begin to think about, okay, and how are things setting up for next year, I would say, boy, we are dry where it would take, we'd need soaking rains to saturate the soil just before we freeze up, and if we don't get that, I don't think there's enough snow to make a difference, come this winter. So, now these droughts sort of turn just as quickly as they came, right? And everything sets up, and we get rain in the fall, and we get piles of snow, and it can turn pretty quickly. But right now, we're not seeing the signs that it's turning yet, for sure.
We're going to take a break right here. When we come back, I want to ask you about a couple of other species. Then we're gonna, I think there's the North Dakota Brood Survey came out here the past few days, and I know you and I and others have been fielding a lot of questions about that. So we want to touch on that. I also want to talk briefly about what we've learned in terms of adaptive harvest management and some of the recommendations coming out of that recent report. And then we'll close up with maybe a few more questions about habitat conditions. So stay with us, folks.
Stay tuned to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, after these messages.
Everybody, welcome back here in studio with my co-host.
Can't remember his
Chris
name,
Jennings.
but yeah.
For the record,
Hey,
I did not
what's
forget
going
your
on,
name.
buddy?
That was me trying to be funny, and it worked, at least to some extent. And joining us remotely is Dr. Scott Stevens. We're talking about the recently released BPOP Survey Results. BPOP, breeding population, is what that stands for. I actually had some other people here recently ask me about that. What does BPOP stand for? Breeding population, shorthand for that.
Yeah, it's not like K-pop or any of that stuff. It's different.
Not here in this building,
different.
anyway. Okay, two species I want your sort of quick thoughts about, Scott. Pintail.
Yeah, so they were up a little bit.
22%.
Yeah,
He's not buying it.
I wouldn't get too excited about that. I mean, when I think about pintails, and especially when we compare to the long-term average, I just think that when we look back at the long-term average of pintails, I'm not sure we're ever going to see the pintails that we saw in the late 70s again, given the changes to the landscape that have happened. So when I look at their variation since then, it's like, okay, yep, there's still ups and downs, but, and so this is up. That's good news. It's a species that we typically have concern about because their numbers have been down from higher numbers previously. But yeah, I mean, if there are more pintails around, that's awesome.
Up 24% from last year, down 43% now from the long-term average. This is another one of those species that, as you mentioned, will overfly the prairies into that boreal area. And we know that some of these birds actually go into what they call the unsurveyed area. And so that's also part of that correction you're talking about for the sake of harvest regulations. And yeah, so this number, this 24% increase, when you juxtapose it to all the other decreases, you have to think this is perhaps maybe partly a reflection of some birds not being counted or estimated last year, if that be the year. Because we got so close, it was like the record low number. And that's
right.
Kind of a difficult thing to message. But I guess it's also, we have to be honest about this. It's an estimate. There are really good estimates of precision around these numbers, but it's still a highly mobile group of animals. It's still 2 million square miles of area that we're trying to extrapolate to. There's still some noise in these estimates from one year to the next, and everybody will acknowledge that, but we do the best we can. Our partners do the best they can, and we work with the data that we get.
I would argue that these surveys were really set up to do a good job of surveying mallards. Like that was the target species. That's how the transects were distributed, was through the core of the mallard range. And so, it probably does the best job with mallards that are also more abundant. So we get more data to feed into those estimates. And when you deal with less abundant species, it's like, there's going to be wider confidence limits. And, you get things like we see with pintails, which doesn't make a ton of sense with ponds down and, all of those things. But it's like, okay, I would interpret that as pintails didn't, we didn't pick up a big decline, so maybe that's good. Are they up as much as the survey suggests? Not sure. Yeah.
And then your favorite species, the blue wing, they were down 19%. They're right at the long-term average, but down 19%. We talked last year about good production for blue wings that folks were supposedly seeing and did see across the landscape. We'll be honest about that. There was production last year.
Was it 18 or 19 when that blue wing number was at like 8 million?
Yeah.
It was fairly recently, wasn't it? I mean, it was.
I'll tell you.
That was a huge number there.
Yeah, and there are species
14,
that can really boom when conditions are right, too. And yeah, when not, then they'll decline. So
did that number surprise you? Down, having blue wings be down?
Yeah, I mean, I thought there were going to be 38 million total ducks. So of course it surprised me.
Well, a few million less blue wings. Yeah,
that's right.
Starting to add up.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about that North Dakota brood survey. Actually, before we touched on the Eastern Survey area a little bit. I guess maybe Scott, your thoughts on that before we get to that brood survey. Your thoughts on the Eastern Survey area. I mean, that's got to be, there were some good numbers in there. If you're someone in the Atlantic Flyway, mallard numbers stayed strong. It looks like it's going to hang on to that 4-bird bag limit that comes at when those levels are up there. No major moves on any of the other species. Black ducks seem to still be showing some stability around that number where they are. So overall, pretty solid picture there out of the Eastern Survey area.
Yeah, it's just a lot less variable than we have in the mid-continent. So, not nearly as big a swings. And so it's kind of steadier populations for the Atlantic Flyway folks.
Chris, anything to add there?
No, I mean, I think just, it's good to have these conversations. People will look at these numbers. And a couple of years ago, it was the Eastern Survey, or last year. This year, I'm getting text messages about, that widgeon number is really down. That's going to hurt us. Like, I don't really know if that's how it works. So it's good to have these conversations and having you guys really explain that a lot of these numbers, it's a good data set. It's good overall information, but it's also something to kind of take with a grain of salt as far as, you've even mentioned it with the pintails, like, you don't really know if that number looks right. But, it just gives everyone kind of a level playing field there. So, and that's especially with the Eastern Survey too. That's why popped in my head there.
Yeah. And I think to that point, Chris, in this being only one of a large number of factors that are going to influence folks' decision to hunt this fall and experiences out in the field this fall. I've heard recently from folks in Louisiana, and I've seen pictures from folks in coastal Louisiana. I've been meaning to send these photos to you. There are significant areas of the marsh, at least in southwestern Louisiana. I don't know about southeastern, where it is dry. I'm talking no water in some of the places where I have hunted before, knee deep and deeper. And it is cracked soil, no water there for blue wings in a lot of those areas, no water in the borrow ditches or the canals into those areas. That's going to be an interesting discussion that we have with Jason Olzak whenever they fly that survey, if things don't change between now and then. It is super dry. So in that landscape, if you have a dry duck lease, it doesn't matter what the breeding population size is. There's some pretty stark images there in parts of Louisiana. Okay, the North Dakota Brood Survey. How many people have contacted you about that?
Probably 10.
And that survey basically said what? Broods are up 80% from last year or something like that. I don't have that report in front of me, but I know it was a very positive message from that survey, which indicated good brood production in North Dakota. And I've had several people contact me and say, Mike, how can this be when breeding population numbers are down? And I'm like, well, let's just slow down here. I mean, those surveys are measuring a breeding population survey and a brood survey are measuring two totally different things. Yes, the brood production depends on breeding ducks being there, but they're measuring two different things. And without having to get into any sort of density dependence type of discussion, you could actually make a case, right, Scott, that when populations are low, productivity, if habitat conditions are good, productivity could be higher.
Yeah, it could be. Now, I haven't spent time in North Dakota this year, but I understand conditions are substantially better there than what I'm looking at. But when I look across the landscape, it's like I would not expect there to be great production because things are dry, right? Just like we talked about. They haven't changed much since May.
And you're talking about at the larger scale.
That's right. Yeah, and that's the other factor. I mean, it's good to have information like this from a specific jurisdiction like North Dakota, but I think, in the breeding population surveys, the eastern Dakotas, which would capture North and South Dakota, even in the peak years in the late 90s and early 2000s, those areas were like 16% of the total breeding population. So, you have to put that in context. It's good that conditions are good in North Dakota. At best, they're 15% of the total. So,
yeah, and that's the other thing that I told folks is that I am happy to hear about duck production in North Dakota. If we didn't have duck production in North Dakota, I would be worried because it was probably set up in the prairies as one of the better places habitat condition wise across North Dakota, South Dakota, and that survey region in Montana. There were somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 million breeding ducks estimated across that landscape. And we know there were good moisture conditions. Maybe they came a little bit late, but they were still good. And I think reports are that they've continued to get some beneficial rain periodically to keep those wetlands in pretty decent shape. That's a good recipe for duckling production. And so I would have been worried if we didn't have some indication of production there. Now, interpreting 80% above last year and whatever it is relative to the long-term average, that's I don't have the report here with me, so I can't really speak to any of that. But the point is, those results are not necessarily inconsistent, or not at all inconsistent with, not necessarily inconsistent with a low BPOP number. They're just different surveys, and I think it's a bright spot that we do have some production there. Mike Tamansky there with North Dakota, I did exchange a couple of emails with him. He said the one thing that he wished would have been stated more clearly in that report is that whenever they started talking about their anticipation for a fall flight in that report, he wished it would have clarified a North Dakota fall flight, as in terms of the number of birds being produced from that state. So that's kind of where we are on that. Let's see. What else do we want to talk about here? I guess harvest management. That's one of the other thing that the Fish and Wildlife Service releases, at the same time they release this status report, the flyway councils, their technical committees meet. There's one of them meeting this week, maybe two of them meeting this week. At least a couple met last week. They take this information, they take the information from the Adaptive Harvest Management Report and use it to develop recommendations for harvest packages for next year. The survey data we have right now from this year will inform harvest regulations in the states for next year. It's done differently in Canada, but the AHM report that is out, which I read over the weekend, states that they anticipate no changes in the harvest regulations across the 4 flyways for next year. Now that's the lead question that I get from folks is like, well, what do all these numbers mean for harvest regulations? That's in the AHM report. They anticipate no changes next year. Now there's a process that has to play out, and we can have somebody come on and talk with us about all the specifics of that. But that's kind of where we are.
Scott, I got a couple questions for you. And
since I've already proved I'm great at speculation about what numbers will be. Yeah.
I'm not going to ask you for any gambling tips or anything.
Right. Exactly.
You've already proven to fail there, but I mean, it is right here. We're recording this on August 28th. Your waterfowl season kicks off in 4 days.
Yeah.
What's the plan? Where are you starting out?
I think you need to sit it out, given these low population numbers.
Yeah, I think you need to probably sit this one out.
Yeah, well, you said something, Mike, earlier about people making their decision on whether to hunt, and I was going to say, my advice is hunt. Like, life is short. You better hunt, even when it's dry and numbers are down. But yeah, I will be out there. Like, I will be hunting. I'll go to some of my usual spots that stage blue wings, and despite the fact that they're down 24% or whatever it was, there will be blue wings there to take advantage of. So
8 of them specifically.
Yeah. The daily bag limit is 8 birds a day up here, so I hope to get into teal and harvest 8 blue wings, or occasionally there'll be some green wings mixed in but the season is open for all the ducks for us. I just am one of the weird guys who focuses on blue wings and, won't shoot other ducks this time of year if I can avoid it.
You'll have plenty of other ducks later in the season, I'm sure. So
yeah, that's right.
Once it gets a little colder and chase those blue wings out, that's probably when it's mallard time. But yeah, no, I just, and what does the kind of the hunting conditions look like? And we've talked about the spring conditions and kind of through the summer, but as we get into early fall, what would you be telling, people are like, hey, I'm planning on going up to Canada to freelance, or, I'm going to Eastern Saskatchewan or something like that. What would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a good question. My advice is usually pretty standard. It's like, okay, you'll want to do your homework, and like when I'm looking for blue wing spots, it's like I'm always looking for shallow water. 6 or 8 inches of water is ideal. I'm not typically hunting small ponds that birds would breed on. I'm hunting more larger water, but there'll be large flats out there. So, that's what I look for, is the same recipe of water depth, depending on the species that you're chasing. But, guys coming to Canada this fall, they will want to spend their time scouting, and that's always good advice. But you may need to put on more miles to find where the water is and where the birds are staged up and using those areas. So that's always good advice. And then, you either purchase the online maps now that have landowners' names, or you can go to the local rural municipality office and purchase a big fold-out map printed on a piece of paper, and you begin the work of tracking down landowners and getting permission, and off you go. So great time of year.
Yeah. Speaking of blue wings, and right around the corner being early teal season here, I saw an email a few days ago from a friend of ours, Chris.
Can't remember anybody's name.
Scott, Paul Dixon over in Northwest Louisiana.
Oh yeah,
right? He's got already has blue wings there on some of his property. It was 105 degrees, and he actually took some photos of these birds and doing some sort of adaptive cooling. It was a pretty neat thing. He sent us an email, and people might see that out on the DU social media at some point. Is a pretty neat observation, sort of explaining some of the adaptations that birds use to cope with those kind of extreme temperatures. But already blue wings in North Louisiana. Let's see. I was going to ask you one other thing. I guess anything else like habitat-wise? We'll have an opportunity to catch up with you in terms of habitat conditions. Other than, I guess, I would remark that you've said in an email here, to anticipate to prepare folks for the fact that it's dry. It's dry there across the prairies, Alberta, western Saskatchewan, and we are now. I mean, how long has it been since we had good moisture conditions in Alberta?
Yeah, a number of years. It's been dry for a while. So, Mike, we exchanged notes before you guys did the show on the BPOP, and I think the advice that I provided is I was back in and reading Johnny Lynch, Escape from Mediocrity, recently, and one of his quotes I thought was appropriate for this year. It's no cause for wild rejoicing, nor is there occasion for panic. And I think that's where we're at this year. It's like, yeah, it's not going to be awesome, not going to be terrible, kind of going to be somewhere in between, but should you hunt? Absolutely, you should hunt.
So, that the title of that, Escape from Mediocrity, whenever you said it, this first time it ever popped in my head, I was going to ask you, is that like the latest self-help book that you're reading, Escape from Mediocrity or something?
It could be, but that name, when you read that title, when you read the article, he's like, very seldom do we escape from mediocrity. and that's accurate for the BPOP.
Yeah.
And we're right in that mediocre zone again. Now, occasionally, things set up and it's awesome, but not many years out of 10 is that the case.
Yeah, you're right. Let's see. In terms of, I cannot let you go without asking you about some of your decoys that you've been carving. I did see a rosy-billed pochard. I am wondering what the limit on rosy-billed pochards is in Canada. Can you help me out there?
I think it must be 8 because there's no species restriction up here. But yeah, we won't find many of those there. I carved those after I got the opportunity to go on a trip to Argentina, and yeah, saw all kinds of cool birds there. Rosy-billed pochards, silver teal were one of my favorites.
Yeah.
I have a decoy that I made that's a silver teal. They're cool. So I have an affection for teal across multiple continents.
So besides those, any other sort of decoy activity?
Still hunting with the blue-winged teal
Skinny
flats? Skinny teal?
I've got skinny teal out now. I completed another full dozen of cork teal, so I've got 2 dozen of my own hand-carved cork teal that I'll be hunting over. So
no new inventions, no new ideas for this year. We have the song dog, the skinny teal, anything. What's next?
Yeah.
What's next on the horizon?
Scott's inventiveness with the skinny teal decoys, that I think he first mentioned this 2 or 3 years ago when you first started coming on the podcast. Well, then the popularity of silhouettes, because they used to be really popular in the 80s, and then all of a sudden the silhouettes just came back. You've got all these manufacturers out here making silhouettes. And so I think it was after you talked about having your skinny teal.
Yeah.
So you're influencing the industry right now.
Influencer extraordinaire.
There we go. Yeah, they work great. I mean, if you find the right water depth, it's not very deep, so the silhouettes along the edge look just like the birds out there. So
cool.
Right. I don't have anything else.
I'm
Chris.
good.
Scott, anything from your end?
I think we've covered the bases. Yeah. You won't let me say, well, so cut that.
Doing some editing now.
Chris Isaac's just shaking his head over here.
He's like, hey, it was all good. I didn't need to do anything. And then he screwed it up.
All right. Scott, appreciate you joining us. We will reconnect with you, no doubt, over the next few months to hear how things unfolded up there. And good luck to you as you get out, and good luck to everybody else. Yeah, for sure. Don't let a down breeding population report discourage you from getting out and chasing these birds. There will be some birds out there for you to get, and good luck doing so. So, Scott, thanks for joining us. Chris, great to have you in here as well.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks, Mike.
A very special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Scott Stevens from DU Canada. We always appreciate him joining us. I also thank my co-host, Chris Jennings, for being here, and thank our producer, Chris Isaac, who always does a great job with everything he does here for the podcast, getting these edited and then out to you. And to you, the listener, we thank you for your time. We thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.